Hey everyone. So this was a discussion on the state of integral theory, which is a philosophical framework we found really useful in the past in Rebel Wisdom. Hopefully the conversation's pretty accessible, but I thought it was worth giving a couple of key concepts that might be useful to frame the dialogue. So firstly, the idea of the four quadrants of knowledge and experience, split between individual and collective, internal and external, and how each needs a different way of engaging and understanding. And also the idea of developmental levels, which first came from spiral dynamics. So the relevant ones for this conversation: modernism, rationality and science, which is coded orange under spiral dynamics, and postmodernism, known as green, which brings in multiple perspectives, but also relativism. So enough intro, and I hope you enjoy the conversation. We're really grateful to be joined by Layman Pascal and Bruce Alderman, who host a podcast called The Integral Stage. For those who aren't familiar, integral theory is a creation mainly of Ken Wilber, and it is still, I'd say, really influential in certainly the circles, Facebook groups that I take part in. It was very, very influential in a lot of kind of intellectual and spiritual circles, especially, I'd say the high point was probably the early 2000s. We did an interview with Ken Wilber now a couple of years ago, and as I say, it's still really heavily influential. I'd love to start maybe by just kind of giving a really open space to Layman and Bruce to talk about, where do you feel it is now? It's just a short summary of where you feel like integral is at now in 2021.
Well, my personal take is that it's in a place that's much more focused on what we call the lower right quadrant, like the systemic elements, logistics, politics. I think it's got a strong focus on embodiment and enactment now. There's a lot of pressure in the community to make that be the focus. I think there's a lot of a shift towards moral embodiment of stage-like development rather than just a cognitive mapping system. And obviously, Ken's still around, right? We owe him a huge debt, but it's been years since a lot of those ideas were developed, and he's an old guy. So everybody's aware that this is moving into a broader place than that. And I think that broadening and that unpacking, the adaptation of integral to different kinds of problems in the world and to people's lives and into relationships with its cousin communities, I think is where it's at right now.
Before our talk, I did a Google Trends search just to see how integral theory and Ken Wilber are doing in terms of measurable metrics, in terms of popular searches and things like that. And there's definitely been a steady decline over the last 20 years. It's actually, if you're looking only in the US, searches for Ken Wilber or integral theory have just steadily declined. If you look globally, it's not quite as steep. If you look for one of my favorite topics, which is integral spirituality, there's not even enough metrics on there to show up. So there was, as David mentioned, kind of a peak of activity, I think, in terms of like public awareness and popularity around the 2000s. And it's picking up again as Wilber has had some recent publications in 2017, and he's doing podcasts again with the Ken Show on Integral Life. But my sense now is similar to what Layman said, is that there's a kind of decentering going on. A lot of people in the integral community call it a diaspora, where people are not feeling a need really to focus on, Ken Wilber or that established set of books and teachings, and get on with the practice of application and research and scholarship. And I think there's actually a great deal of activity going on all over the world. And there are programs in different universities. There's projects all over the world. But I think possibly the integral community could do a better job of making those things known. Right now, a lot of them are under the radar.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear the flip side. We're talking now about the way integral is sort of declining, or at least kind of decentering from where it was. But it'd be nice to talk a bit and give people some context, especially if they're not so familiar with Integral, about what was so exciting about it in those early 2000s. Like for me, I came across it in, I think, 2005, and I was in university, and it was kind of like spirituality for nerds in a way, for me personally. And it was the first time I could kind of map certain experiences or map the whole, or just kind of, let's say the first time I had the idea that, oh, spirituality can be something more than just a hazy internal experience. It can be mapped. That's just one element of it, of course. And there's also a sense-making element of it, of being able to have a map of reality that's as full as possible in any given moment. So be nice to hear from you guys. Like what really excited you about it? What was special about it at its peak?
Well, I can speak personally, which is that I had a number of profound seeming internal experiences at one point in my life. And it was like I had a huge additional amount of internal space, and I was super thirsty for to fill that space with anything that looked like it acknowledged and went beyond postmodernism. That took plurality and relativism and deconstruction and intersection. I took that really seriously, incorporated that, but tried to get to a more integrated, more universal, more functional place with it. So I was absorbing philosophers who were all sort of doing that, or maybe doing that. And so I came across Ken Wilber, who actually I'd known about when I was a kid. I read some Ken Wilber books as a kid and thought, oh yeah, of course, and then moved on. But now I was hungry for it, and I saw that there was a language to describe this shift there. And so I got involved initially because I just wanted to make sure that I understood that language and could talk that language. But then what I found was, and this was my real underlying emotional question, was, are these my people? Right? And what I found was a certain percentage of them definitely are. This is the community space in which I want to be, where people are interested in a multidimensional, full spectrum developmental attempt to incorporate and go beyond where we are as a civilization. So for me personally, that's the minimum requirement for the kind of community in which I feel okay.
I also had come across Ken Wilber when I was young, and initially I didn't like his books. I thought, how can you map spirit? How can you chart spirit? And I was turned off by that. But then I ended up heading overseas, and I spent many years at different monasteries and ashrams in Asia, a number of different countries, and did a lot of intensive practice, and returned to the United States with an intention to integrate some of that experience with my own Western education and my own Western vocational interests. And by chance, I came across Ken Wilber's books again and found that they actually provided what I was seeking internally from my own experience of how do we bring the best together of thinking from, traditional contemplative traditions and modern scientific and postmodern orientations, and possibly move beyond the limitations of those. I never was interested in or on board with really the kind of, sometimes Integral is criticized for being a little bit too self-absorbed and inflationary, that we've got the answer for everything. And that never attracted me. But I did really feel that there was a lot of potential there for bringing together and synthesizing multiple perspectives in a holistic way that could really serve broad human development. And so, that reignited my interest. And I tried to seek out an education in that. I couldn't find it exactly, but I found something in transpersonal psychology. And I knew Ken Wilber had been very influential in transpersonal psychology. So I took that route and was able to incorporate that. And then later, actually, integral degree programs were birthed, and they're still existing.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I'd love if we could touch on and get through before we get to the Q&A. One of which is this question of what kinds of people are being attracted to Integral. And I know that you put a post on Facebook asking for questions and thoughts from the Integral community. And this is one of the key topics in culture now, kind of diversity and the sense of like which perspectives are being included. And I think I'd love to do a deep dive on that in a moment. The question of, we are Integral certainly seems to be a lot of kind of geeky white guys trying to kind of put the world to rights from their minds. And that's a really interesting kind of, it certainly seems to attract people from that demographic, and whether that is an issue in itself is something I'd love to go into. And that kind of speaks to a lot of the kind of cultural hot button issues at the moment. And I think Integral also has a really interesting map to try and make sense of that we'll come to. But the first question I have is, like, we went and we did an interview with Ken. I kind of got a sense of like the integral industry. And my sense is that because whenever you build an industry around any kind of philosophy or any kind of set of thought, I think you start to create incentive. The reason I think that I reached out to you two is that you're enough on the fringes of it to understand and to see what's going on in the community. But I feel that you maybe have more opportunity to speak freely.
I think, and it's true, Bruce and I are in a unique position because we have a lot of sympathies with a lot of different factions within the community. And we've also set up this podcasting set of series in which now I've talked to, every kind of integralist, high and low. So I've got a pretty good sense of what it is. Before I address your question, I want to just remind everybody that it's not exactly obvious what this word means, integral. Like, we're using it like we know what we're talking about, but it has at least two sets of meanings. Sometimes I say integralist and integralite. And for me, an integralist is somebody who, regardless of their internal structure, understands and has heard about and can talk in the terms of this theoretical model. And an integralite is somebody who sees the things and experiences the things that this model is talking about, whether they've heard about it or not. So where I think we need to go, and I think where we are going, is a large number of communities consist of people who see and experience those dynamic patterns, and they're finding each other across their different terminological, conceptual differences. To your question, yes, I feel very free to speak my mind. Now, that's partly temperamental. I'm usually willing to take communication risks. Maybe not everybody is. Other people might feel that pressure differently. But I think for some time now, the so-called integral community has been so diverse, so full of factions, and so full of interesting characters that I think everybody is pretty comfortable expressing themselves. I don't think there's any sense of suppression, and there's certainly very little sense of, like a late 90s feeling that you have to toe the party line. I feel very few people feel like they're brand ambassadors anymore.
I think there was a shift in some of the early integral theory conferences, where possibly the very first integral theory conference in the US was very Wilber-centric. But beyond that, there was a concerted effort to really expand out and bring in more critical voices and really, I think, be more balanced in the approach. I don't feel any sense of restriction either. I think some of the things that we talk about on our program and explore on the integral stage are probably things that would not be aired on Integral Life. So there is some kind of limitation on what can be shared on the Ken-centered communication platforms, because they're really wanting to focus on putting forward Ken's vision and message, and there's less of an interest in bringing in outside perspectives to the degree that we're wanting to do with our YouTube channel.
Yeah, so that point around the sort of disembodied quality. I mean, there's lots of things I think Integral misses, but when we had Jamie Wheel on talking about this, I think he called it something like disembodied eggheads playing and being Jedi, which is a funny way to say it. I mean, it sounds like that's kind of what you're saying, and I guess we all have kind of some element of that. But is there I mean, you mentioned before, this movement towards this kind of deeper embodiment of actually putting this stuff into practice. And I mean, I'm curious about that, because traditionally it's been hard to see that in Integral, to really make that link between Integral then being played out in the world and being used in different areas. I mean, have you seen that? Are you seeing that? Or is that the next step for Integral?
Yeah, I would just say that although there is The fact that people feel like embodiment is the next step indicates that they sense there was an insufficiency of embodiment before. And I think that's not just in the integral community, that's also in a number of other higher discourse communities where people are trying to solve civilization and developmental problems. However, there is also an issue around how you access this stuff and understand it and how it gets communicated. Because if you drop into a verbal text-based community around ideas, you're going to get very word-heavy, idea-focused conversations. You can't help that. If you pick up a book on a philosophy, you're going to get a verbal readout of a philosophy. And that might be how you come into it, but you're not going to see the person. You're not seeing the people who are working every day in their lives to work with the stuff that might be expressed by those ideas. So when we take a sampling, we get an overly intellectual, overly disembodied version of that phenomenon. Like, what counts as integral? Is it people doing it in their yards and their kitchens? Yes, that absolutely counts, but we don't register that because we register when somebody writes a book or makes a lecture and talks about it. So I think we have to weight that appropriately ourselves, although there clearly is a need to be more embodied.
I wonder as well, as you're both talking, Integral at one point, Al Gore was into it, Alanis Morissette, it had this cultural capital. But if I look at the influence of Integral from what you were talking about there, Bruce, and those kind of small projects, it's what Ken talked about to us as well. It was very small scale, very kind of experimental, compared to the impact that like intersectionality and wokeness has had on culture, where it's in every HR department, it's in almost every movie, every TV show. It just strikes me that Integral is very sophisticated and very difficult to explain. We've spent ages trying to explain Integral and try and boil it down. We've spent long time doing that. And that's tough. It's difficult to simplify it. Whereas, certain things with more of a mimetic pull are much easier to say. It's all about power and oppression. And if you want to get on board and you want to be a carrier of this meme, you need 3 talking points and you're good to go. With Integral, it's like, okay, well, whoa, there's Aqual and there's this, and you got to know the difference between states and stages. And actually, let's rewind a second, because so I wonder if the next stage or a next stage of Integral is a kind of not even just embodiment, but something that's simplifying and making it emotionally resonant, because that's what I think intersectionality has. For all of its misguidedness, in my view, it's got an emotional resonance to it.
I think that's it's true, but there's two ways forward for Integral, and they both have to happen. One is to make it simpler and more engaging, and the other is to make it more nuanced and more complex, right? So we have to go we need to move the ideas to their next level, and that's going to take an enormous amount of richness and effort, and it's going to be strange. On the other hand, we need to access people, which means it has to be simple and emotional, and different people are going to have to specialize in different functions.
Yeah, Layman and I just have been talking about working on a book together, and so that is probably pretty much guaranteed to be strange and difficult to digest for many people. But yeah, I agree that there has to be concurrent efforts to translate to the community. I think there's a risk when you popularize ideas too much and too quickly, is that they get picked up by people without maybe the preparation for actually embodying and integrating what they actually entail, and then they get applied in a more simplified form that may be actually counterproductive. And I think, for instance, intersectionality is an example of that.
Yeah, I would just like to say a couple more things about that, because the model itself sort of suggests exactly what you're talking about, right? Is that people are moving into green, postmodern, pluralistic, deconstructionist, intersectional thinking. That's going to happen before they get to an integrative version of that same relativistic critique, right? So they're going to have to get that first. There's no way we're going to supersede that. The model predicts that they would have to grow through and really enrich that. So I think we have to be ready to receive people who are doing that, and to help that phenomenon, that woke phenomenon, be an integrally friendly, developmental version of what it's trying to do. But I think maybe Ken, and to some degree people who look at the situation through the lens of the 80s, 90s, and early 2000s, I don't think they incorporated as much of the pluralistic critique as they need to. Like, it's continuing to evolve and expand, and we have to keep sort of integrating and combining it. So it's going to be powerful. It's going to get more powerful, and people have to be able to do some version of that first before they're aware of the need to bring that back together somehow.
One quick follow-up on that, just personal experience from that. So I teach in multiple different campuses, and one of the campuses that I teach at, the largest, I think, contingent, among students come from the LGBTQ community, and we have a lot of, activists and, also trans students in our classes, and Integral is famously rejected, by, a lot of people in the so-called green postmodern community, and criticized. But in my experience of teaching it, especially in this campus, but elsewhere too, I found that without ever addressing, the topics that they're immediately concerned with, but just going through the full, set of ideas in as embodied and practical way as I can. I've been approached many times by students who are, through that, beginning to see the limitations of their own discourse, the limitations of some of their own strategies, and are feeling a kind of quickening towards something else that was missing, that they knew was missing, but they weren't able to articulate. So that's been encouraging, even though it's, a small anecdotal thing.
Yeah, you're already pushing into the area that I think is where we might spend most of the rest of the call. As you say, you're kind of already starting to talk about kind of this tension between, in Integral terms, green and, I mean, I guess it boils down to which parts of green do we want to integrate. Integral is about integrating and transcending. And what I find really fascinating, so obviously green is radically kind of relativistic. So it has an allergy to anything that reintroduces hierarchy. And by definition, Integral introduces the idea of hierarchy. It's developmental levels. And so there's going to be a tension there. And what I find really intriguing when I look at some of the Integral groups online is when I look at Ken's work, and most recently the Trump in a Post-Truth World, for me, he lays out the pathologies of the culture really, really well. Like what happens, you end up, if you obliterate all hierarchy, you end up in narcissism, you end up in relativism. And in a way, the paradox for me is that Integral, as far as it is kind of oriented with Ken's writing, seems like it should be inoculated against some of the pathologies of the culture. And yet I see some of those same conversations and those same divisions playing out within Integral itself. I'd love to hear your reflections on where you feel like, because that for me is now the fundamental dividing line in culture. And if Integral is useful for anything, it's that showing us a place beyond that. So we're not just in pure rejection of green values, of postmodernism, of intersectionality. We can actually hold the values of that worldview without falling prey to maybe some of the ideological traps or the kind of reductio ad absurdum of some of the kind of cultural dynamics we're seeing play out. So where do you see that fundamental kind of dividing line in culture, and how is that playing out in Integral itself?
Well, I think within the community and conversation that we might call Integral, you're going to get all kinds of different people who are coming from different places. And I think one of the things that in my mind is more and more obvious to the community is that these distinctions and stages are stylistic rather than content based, right? Two people can show up and they can talk about Integral, and they can be coming from very different levels, right? To be Integral is not to be able to use Integral words. It's to have a style of behavior and a set of structures that we would want to describe by those terms. And the same thing is true at the green intersectional pluralistic consciousness. Is a lot of people who profess the ideas around that are not really there. right? Their moral and aesthetic and emotional understanding doesn't match up with the words they're using, because once you make some words, that's just a tool. And our model is anybody at any level can use any tool. You can, right? Primitives can't build a nuclear bomb, but they could certainly get one and set one off. Likewise, the concept of intersectionality, you may have to at least partially get into that pluralist consciousness to create that concept. But once it exists, it can be given to anybody who's coming from any level. So you're going to have modernist intersectionality and dogmatic primitive intersectionality. And so it's important to separate out those different forms, and also to ask ourselves, are there things in the current environment that are causing people to regress down that hierarchy of inclusion, right? Pathological elements that make those interesting new concepts show up in unhealthy ways. So that's all on one side. And the other side is, yeah, it's insufficient. Pluralism is insufficient. There's a need to go beyond it. The way Ken Wilber phrased things might have been a little hasty, a little simplistic. Maybe there wasn't as much pluralism then. But also when you want to distinguish something, you say, I have a new thing, so I'm obviously going to be incentivized to distinguish it from the previous thing, right? So people who want to be yellow or teal, there's a real strong incentive to like separate yourself from green, to objectify it, and in a way to belittle it so that you can move on. And that's appropriate. But we need to understand that this green culture still exists and is still evolving, and we have to enfold it, and that the people who speak in these terms are not necessarily at that stage of development. So only some of them are green. The rest of them are modernist or dogmatic, or however we would like to characterize those developmental phases.
I think there have possibly been a couple missteps, in the integral formation in terms of the emerging community since, maybe 2005, especially, or a little bit before that, when they were first launching some of the integral media platforms. And Ken Wilber at that time said, if you read and understand my work, you are integral. And I think that was a misleading message. It's actually not the case. And it's easy to read those books and pick up something from them and use the language and not really inhabit the sensibility that birthed them, just as Layman is talking about too. So I agree with that with that critique about, intersectionality or green, and not everyone is intersectionalist, in that community is actually at that cognitive stage of development. The same is true in integral theory. And I think some of the fault lines we find in integral theory, in the integral community, are due to, different developmental stages, grasping onto these ideas and using them in different ways. But it's not only that. There are also typological and other kinds of differences that are leading to some of the, the splits and the divisions and the, the kind of the tension, cultural tension that exists currently, and it's mirrored in this community, and unfortunately hasn't proved to be inoculated against that as one might have hoped. But I think part of that is because, indeed, the integral community does not consist of everybody being at the same level, of individuals who are at the same level of development or sophistication of appreciation of those ideas. And I think regarding green, an essay came out many years back by, I think, Gary Hampson. I think it was called The Way Out is the Way Through. And he was really looking at how integral interprets green. And, Layman was mentioning that there's some, necessity of distancing yourself from green and, through critique in order to move on to, a different view. And I think that's true. But I think also in the broader community, maybe not so much among, some of the people who are very serious about integral, but in the broader community, there hasn't really actually been adequate digestion of green before hurrying on and trying to occupy a different space.
Yeah, I want to ask, so in the conversation that we had with Ken, and obviously this has come up a lot with Rebel Wisdom, that this question of like what parts of green to integrate. And we had obviously an original focus on Jordan Peterson and what the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson said about culture. And for me and for Ken, when we spoke to him, it was really about these sort of traditional values that had been forgotten or erased or just not valued in sort of post-modernity. And he was really bringing back those traditional values. And Ken said, well, Integral sees what's missing. That's kind of how, and for me, that was certainly true. Like, it was a sense of, yeah, we've lost our way to some degree. There are some timeless truths about humanity that Jordan Peterson is speaking to, and this is coming back. But I would also admit that personally, I have a little bit of a green allergy. Like, I probably overreact to some parts of that. I think we all probably have some allergies in some areas. But the key question, I guess, is how do you see these dynamics playing out in Integral? Where do you think, what's your answer to that question of what parts of traditionalism have we not integrated and we need to integrate? What parts of green are we not integrating that we need to integrate? Where would you reflect that? Because I know, Layman, we spoke a little while ago and you asked me that question about rebel wisdom, and maybe we can dive a little bit more into that when maybe we do a reverse conversation on your show. But I'm interested in that getting down to that sort of that fault line. Where do you see those pieces playing out?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think very pertinent to the moment of history that we find ourselves in. I do a lot of work around what I call like meta-progressive politics. Steve McIntosh calls it post-progressive, or there's different ways to think about that. But that idea is there's something really important about what's coming forward in these pluralistic communities, which are to some degree real and to some degree superficial and inhabited by people who don't actually understand those terms. The ideas they're bringing forward, I think in general, are all good. What we need to integrate is all of the parts of that. But what we need to be able to do is say, here's what a balanced version of that looks like. Here's what a healthy version of that looks like. So Integral consists of a number of like, it's like Ken was saying, it's what's missing, right? It's the things you need to include, that if you don't include those things, you're going to get a distorted outcome, right? And so one thing is how Ken packaged those things, integral theory. The other thing is, yeah, those are the things. You could just imagine them taken out of the package and put in a sack. And lots of other communities also recognize those things, those types of perspectives. So we need those. But among those are development, among those are health, among those are conscious and unconscious, among those are left and right. So when we look at green, first of all, we have to understand it appropriately, which is what's actual green and what's non-green using green terms. And then what's green look like on multiple developmental intelligence lines, and how does it become healthy, which is to be able to enact those lines in tandem with each other without regressing. And to be able to do that in a way that encompasses the types of people, right? Which are masculine and feminine, it's left and right, it's the big five, it's all the basic types. So if we're looking from a meta perspective to favor and help green because we need it, we want to say, all of those components, all those ideas are correct. But here is the left and right version of that idea. Here is the healthy and unhealthy version of that idea. And here is some help and encouragement to bring a simultaneously left and right healthy version forward to make a bridge to what's on the other side.
Yeah, I think I'd add two things to that. A while back, I talked to Ali about the notion of a regression in the service of transcendence, and my sense that that seems to be happening culturally at this time. Psychologically, it's a period, usually a period of existential crisis that leads to a lifting of certain repression barriers that we had been carrying, and the surfacing of older forms of consciousness that can temporarily overwhelm. It can be seen as, a pathological regressive movement, but I think the integral approach would want to see some of what's manifesting as at least an opportunity to fold in what is erupting by recognizing what are authentic values and concerns and needs that are being expressed, even if they're showing up pathologically or destructively or in immature ways right now. Nevertheless, there may be elements that need to be folded in and acknowledged that are not being properly acknowledged, and that's why there's this this fissure and this eruption. And in terms of things to carry forward from green, I think there's many different things. One that I have emphasized in my own work is just the insight into pluralism, and which we Integral has its own way of unpacking, but that we would want to look at maybe what Greg Thomas is calling rooted cosmopolitanism or integral pluralism. If you look religiously, there's been a movement, there's a kind of exclusivism at traditional, within traditional frames where, there's the in-group and out-group, and that's very clearly defined. A more modernist approach is more inclusive, where it would want to fold other, people from other communities into the central guiding vision, but it usually, through that inclusion, privileges its own position and then wants to include the others in some kind of subordinate role. Pluralism recognizes kind of the hegemonic and colonialist tendencies that are present in that move, and looks to actually liberate people along their own cultural trajectories and not enfold them only in one single master narrative. And I think there's something of value in that. And some of the green criticism of Integral has been, it seems like it's doing that modernist move of including them all within a single master vision that colonializes them and subordinates them. And so I think the work for Integral that's been going on and still needs to go on is actually a way that actually can honor the multiple forms of expression and recognize the truths within each, that's not merely relativistic, but that can actually find factors that inform these movements that are all analogs of each other or homeomorphic equivalents of each other that are worth recognizing and worth honoring in their distinctness.
Yeah, I'd like to just add one thing about the role that conservative feelings and ideas and world spaces play in regard to this, which is Integral, but also pluralist, green, postmodern, have left and right polarizations. And so I don't think there's been an adequate integration into progressive, democratic, socialist, deconstructive, pluralist. They haven't incorporated their right wing properly, right? What is a right-wing pluralist? It's Nietzsche, it's Joe Rogan. There's a lot of sort of solid, old-fashioned, virtue demonstrating, conservative pushback in spaces that are cognitively pluralistic and relativistic. So pluralism needs to incorporate its left and right wing together much better, but it also has to incorporate what we think of as amber blue traditional society values in a much better way, because a lot of people are in that place, that it's rural, agrarian, the sense that we should be ruled by an authoritarian monarch-like figure, and that we've got to let go of a lot of this liberal nonsense, and we've got to be more nationalistic, right? That's a serious thing. And if we don't incorporate that thing, we're going to continually get sabotaged by reactive ethno-nationalists, because they are accurately pointing out that something is missing. And if you want to get, as I do, some progressive cultural changes, some system upgrades, then you're going to have the spirit of conservatives on board. Rural, traditional, I grew up in that kind of world. And so I feel very strongly that it's essential to fold that flavor in. And also, it's important to understand that it is a flavor, because what we call rational modernism, orange, right? It does a double checking move. It does reason. It does science, has this strategic approach to making language meaningful. But before that, language was more symbolic, more evocative, more affective. And there's a lot of things that traditional rural people need that are actually flavor, they're actually aesthetic. They need symbolic recognition. And it's perfectly feasible to think of progressive systemic upgrades with emotional, symbolic recognition of the virtues and values applicable to traditional people.
I think that's really well said. And for me, it feels like we in some sense could be circling back to somewhere where we started. You were talking about this desire in the community to be more embodied, which is such a hazy term, but there is a term I think is an integral and is very important and necessary for all of this to happen, which is the shadow, understanding those aspects of ourselves that we cut off and reject. And for people who identify themselves as progressive, we've been talking about this on the channel for ages, and we're largely inspired by Ken as well in Trump and the Post-Truth world. Progressives need to own their traditionalist shadows and the many other shadows, and vice versa. And so, we've spoken to Dosheen Roshi on the channel, Diane Musho Hamilton. Dosheen said one time to us when we were in Denver, he was like, my dojo is like, not dojo, sorry, but the Integral Zen place is just down the road from Ken's loft, but so many people don't come here. This is, from his perspective, it's a very upper left thing, but it's like, that is the work. That the work is for all of us to find those aspects where we have an allergy, we're in a strong rejection, and it's gritty, dirty work, but amazing as well. And I think this kind of highly cognitive version of Integral is some I think it's a kind of emotional avoidance, or can be an emotional avoidance of doing that down and dirty work. So I'm very curious to see how that starts playing out in the Integral community, and it might have to get a little bit messy and scrappy, as some of the Facebook groups are actually.
Yeah, and I was going to add to that as well, Layman, because I know that we've touched on this before. Masculinity, like the cultural conversation around masculinity and those masculine virtues, I think is right at the core of this. And also the sense of integrating like healthy aggression, healthy anger. And that for me is like at the core of certainly the left shadow. It feels like that conversation. And I'm also interested, like how much of that is underneath all of the kind of cultural dynamics that we're seeing, like how much of it is ultimately a kind of yin yang, masculine, feminine kind of dynamic playing out at the level of culture, which is another really fascinating lens that we can use.
Yeah, you and I talked a little bit about the problem of the difficulty of integrating aggression in the pluralistic experience. And while I think that's very true, we can also get carried away with that analysis. Like it is a little bit odd for four intellectual white guys to be sitting here wondering whether there's not enough emphasis on the masculine.
Yeah.
Right. So we have to treat these things in a complex way. Nonetheless, there is a problem with certain demonizations of aggression and masculinity within some of the progressive conversations. So we have to take that into account. But I think there's an important thing here about broadening. I mean, that's my general theme, right? Broadening the things Ken says need to be included, broadening that beyond Ken's model, broadening the community beyond itself to interface with other communities, and broadening the definitions, broadening our sense of the definitions, because cognition can sound like you're talking about intellectual recognition, like you're just a scholastic test is going to be given and can you recognize these patterns? And sometimes that is what it means, but the way Ken's trying to use it, the way I want him to be trying to use it, is much richer. That cognition is your ability, your embodied existential capacity to work with some pattern as if you recognize it, right? And what we know about the brain is most of our cognition is subconscious. And it has multiple dimensions. It has feelings, it has thoughts, it has things that are linear, things that are non-linear. So we have to understand when we hear someone talk about cognitive development that really it's potentially a much more interesting, complex thing that isn't in the front recognition, consciousness, waking mode, but actually touches on all this stuff. And you mentioned the shadow. That's why I'm saying this, which is that's the zone in which things are going on. Our development is primarily subconscious cognitive development, and the subconscious is inhibited by certain patterns and shadows. It could be things that are being left out. It could be things that it needs, could be things that it sees backwards, but we have to be able to work in the area, the part of ourselves that we're not recognizing in order to actually do this rather than just talking about it.
So we are coming very close to the time where we're going to flip to the Q&A section. If you haven't been following the chat, if you could maybe go and have a look at the questions and add your initials to upvote any of the questions that you particularly want asked. Before we do that, I just want to invite Layman or Bruce. Is there anything that you think we should have talked about that we haven't talked about yet?
Not necessarily, but I'd say something is I've been away at the cabin for 2 days for my birthday. And something that's been on my mind out there is our relationship to our elders, right? And so at this point, Ken Wilber is one of those. Not everybody who's old is one of our elders. But if people are interested in human development and they're interested in incorporating, but also going beyond the pluralistic dimension of the current society, and they want to acknowledge shadow and they want to acknowledge the multiple dimensions of ourselves, then this is one of our elders. And I personally, I'm talking to a lot of people on these various series. And when I talk to one of the older ones, I want to appreciate that whatever our experiential or intellectual or temperamental differences are, these are elders in our community, and they deserve our acknowledgement and respect because we have a lot to learn from them, and we don't even know all the ways in which we can learn from them. So I think it's really important for us to venerate the people who have tried to do the general kind of thing that we collectively are trying to do.
I think one thing I would add, and we did touch on it, but I think kind of what's up for the integral community that I feel is a reaching out to kin communities and efforts to dialogically engage with, mutually enrich different kinds of communities that are emphasizing different things, from complex thought to critical realism to the intellectual dark web or the intellectual deep web of syntheism, metamodernism, game beat. I think they're all bumping up into similar spaces in terms of sets of social concerns and kind of awarenesses of the limitations of past cultural memes. And so I think that kind of decentering from necessarily just Aqua model, but really looking at interfacing with the broader meta community is really what's up right now, and that feels most exciting and fruitful for me.
Awesome. Great. That's a really nice segue into some of the questions we've got coming up. So if you want to turn your camera on, you can. It'd be nice to see some faces. And we will invite you to unmute yourself and ask your question. And we will start with the most upvoted question, which is from Lisa Norton.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I think my question, you've talked so much about it already, so I'm not sure if it's as timely as it was, but maybe has some things in common with what Bruce just said and what Graham put in the chat. I was originally thinking about Jean Gebser, and even Ken himself has said that he didn't use the meta-modern language of structure of feeling. But I guess I should read my question. Was please elaborate on the integral light structures of feeling regardless of labels and terminologies. I think even Ken said this, that speaking in terms of developmental cognition from that bias, then this is an evolutionary emergent that's coming online globally, regardless of what names we might give it. I don't know how many people might have caught Jonathan Rowson's wonderful talk in the STOA yesterday, but I think what I would put out there as a conversation provocation is that I still feel in this conversation that we're assuming a shared object, that we mean the same thing when we talk about integral. And so Jonathan, it's easy for a late stage cognizer to kick the models to the curb after studying them thoroughly. So I would say there is a certain fashionableness to being anti-model. And I think that says a lot about the complexity and urgency of the times. I'll leave it at that.
Well, hi, Lisa. I work with Jonathan on a metamodern anthology project, so I know him really well. And I guess what stands out to me from that question is the notion of thinking of these stage-like transformations as being felt qualities, right? And that personally, that's a bit temperamental. Like certain temperaments will experience it more cognitively and certain ones will experience it more affectively. But I think we all are keyed into something that's pre-intellectual and pre-cognitive about these stages. So they have different moods, and the so-called second-tier stages also have their characteristic moods. And these are often part of it's novel, part of it's emergent, and part of it's a hybridization, which is that each one can take the moods of the previous one and mix them in a new way. So I think these communities are collectively feeling something in common about the way all the parts we have, which are all felt parts, might be able to be integrated together.
Great. The next most upvoted question was Graham Pilger.
First of all, thanks for coming and talking about this. It's a really fascinating topic. And so you've definitely touched on some pieces of the question that I wrote, but I was asking, do you see the intellectual dark web as an indication of a revival of integral thinking? And then sort of alongside that, like after seeing that movement fall apart, more or less, what needs to change about integral theory or the culture at large for a more sustainable integral conversation to infect the culture in the same way that postmodernism has in recent years, after sort of being on the back burner since the 60s and 70s?
I think there were aspects of the intellectual dark web that were, integral in spirit. I wouldn't say all of the players or elements of it matched my sense of integral, but definitely some did. And it was refreshing to see, because it was, being approached from a different angle. And I think one of the things that integral can learn is really to engage with the topics that are most pressing culturally right now, and that it often remains a little bit abstract and aloof and focuses more on spiritual topics, or it will venture into political ones, but it hasn't done very well, I think, in wrestling directly and publicly, with some of the prominent voices in the community with the issues that are confronting us right now, such as Jordan Peterson taking on certain questions and issues, and that integral thinkers have, for whatever reason, not really ventured into those territories as directly or maybe as with as much risk taking as Peterson did, and the Weinsteins and some others did.
The notion of whether something has fallen apart, whether it's the IDW or the integral community, it's really uncertain, because its effectiveness in the world is going to take a long time to evaluate, and it's mostly going to show up in forms that aren't identified with the label. And I'm very encouraged by that, right? The spread of the parts of the integral worldview it almost comes at the expense of people acknowledging and calling it that, right? It's about the reality of how those patterns move into the world and not about whether people are searching for that word online. On the Jordan Peterson is fascinating. There's been a conversation for years, Integral's attempt to evaluate Jordan Peterson, right? Like, what level is he at? And it very often depends on who's doing it, how much information they know, whether they're leaning right or left in themselves. But clearly, Jordan Peterson has an awareness and a critique of postmodern pluralism, which many of the people in the IDW have. Now, whether that critique means they're operating from a higher level, or whether they're like, the term a self-loathing Jew, right? There's self-negating postmodernists, right? Is Jordan Peterson beyond postmodernism, or is he a self-loathing pluralist? It's hard to say, right? Both of those are potentially useful interpretations. But I think in general, the IDW has had a certain conservative limitation, right? A certain unwillingness to see elements of the political progressive agenda that are very important, and a certain generalized temperamental element that really attracts certain people and puts other people off. Nonetheless, I think they definitely are. They've been an important piece of the conversation for a few years, and they're recognizing what's going on in the world, and they're suggesting critiques, and some of them, more than others, are probably integral thinkers, integral feelers, integral understanders.
Bruce, did you want to say something? I've got a lot to say to this, so I'll wait until you've.
Okay. Yeah, I was just going to jump in with a comment that's pretty much what happened to psychosynthesis. Psychosynthesis was really, well ahead of its time and developed a lot of practices and techniques and perspectives. And it didn't end up propagating very strongly as its own movement, but a lot of its orientations and insights and tools got picked up and flowered in many other different areas. And if you look around multiple transpersonal schools of thought and other humanistic psychological schools of thought, a lot of them have borrowed from psychosynthesis without acknowledging it, but they're using the insights from Assagioli. And I think in some ways that's happening in part right now, even with the movements that are currently, active and gaining maybe more attention with metamodernism and Game B. And there are definitely players in those circles who are drawing from Integral and using those tools without really giving that name to it. But nevertheless, the inspiration has been there, and I think it's insight that's been genuinely owned and digested, and is being deployed in the ways that these individuals see fit. So it's a spreading of integral thinking, but not with the integral label.
Yeah, I just wanted to say to the question about the intellectual dark web, because I think I first wrote, that was actually why we got in contact with Ken originally, is he read a piece that I wrote that included describing the intellectual dark web as a nascent integral conversation. I think I was quite careful to say a nascent integral conversation, because I think what constellated it originally was a kind of resistance to green, saying there is a problem here and we're identifying it. And that was pretty much the main alliance between the people within it. And you saw this kind of resistance of a lot of people within it to kind of move beyond the critique to solutions. There was a really fascinating conversation between Eric Weinstein and Jordan Peterson on the Dave Rubin report, where you could see the frustration that Peterson was just getting into a well-worn critique of kind of crazy postmodernism. And Weinstein was saying, okay, let's come up with some solutions. Let's come up with some solutions to the trans issue. Let's come up with some solutions to these kind of issues that have kind of wrapped us around the axle. And there was a real sense of, and another interesting thing is that both Brett and Eric were, when I first met them, and I asked them about Integral, I was like, are you aware of Integral? This is a really useful model when you look at kind of Integral versus like the developmental levels, actually, for me, show where resistance to green just comes from an orange level, or where it's pushing forward to a kind of transcend and include. And I said, this is really useful. And both Brett and Eric initially were very hostile to Integral. They were aware of it, but they were kind of like, no, I'm not interested. And independently, both of them whether that was for strategic reasons and they realized they had potential allies there that they could work with, or they looked into themselves independently, came back and said, no, I'm interested. At one point, Eric was interested to meet Ken. He asked me to put him in touch with Ken. And Brett also went from being very resistant to being interested in it and interested in kind of learning a bit more about the model. So I do think that, and I think those two were the most forward thinking of the members of the IDW at the time. I think Rogan is a sort of a different case, because I think he's actually a more naturally embodied player, because I think he's less intellectual. He's much more embodied. He's kind of been punched in the face a lot. He thinks very quickly, and I'd say he's almost the most naturally integral person in that constituency, because he doesn't get hung up around the intellectual stuff like I think Eric and Brett have. And we could kind of talk about where they get hung up in their own way. And I think there's a lot of incentive structures, there's a lot of audience capture, there's a lot of kind of other issues there that we could go into. But I do think it was a nascent conversation that got stuck and did not push forward. It didn't really engage with critics. It didn't really integrate the conversation with the left. It didn't really push that forward. And the idea of how we as a group, and you bring in metamodernism, you bring in Game B, you bring in Integral, like, I think we need to start pushing this forward, and I'm interested in how we do that for sure.
Yeah, we need to push it forward. And at the same time, it's impossible to really evaluate what these things are, right? 10 years from now, we'll have a very different sense of the IDW than we've had over the last 2 or 3 years. So all of these things are nascent in some manner. And I appreciate what you're saying, because there's a huge difference between the Weinstein brothers and Dave Rubin. Right? So all these people are at different places in themselves. I like the Weinsteins. I've got a few critiques, but in terms of the structures that they need to reach for in order to describe their emerging insights, those are often very aligned with what Integral is trying to describe.
So we have some more really good questions. Next one is Adriana Forte.
Hi. Thank you for this. It was really, really lovely hearing you. I think I need my question. Let me try to copy it here, because basically what I was pointing to, it's that ironically, it's like this double bind of needing to be at an integral stage of development to be able to really critique Integral from a place of not just projecting. So that's where I'm sitting with, because there's so much critique, and they're not all born equal. So the ones that you kind of take into account, that's really like they feel they know and they experience Integral, and from that perspective they can see further, and also the ones that actually can't see it at all, and they're just in a lower stage of the rung, developmentally speaking, and they just project whatever they imagine Integral is and critique it. So I'd love to hear you speaking about it.
Definitely, I think that's the case, that we do have, critiques of Integral which seem to be very uncomfortable with its postmodern aspects. And I would say that, to the degree that it is uncomfortable with some of the more, you could say, postmodern aspects of integral theory, or if it's unable to digest, any notion of development or hierarchy that could be productive, it could be generative, could be held in a way that actually serves growth and serves community and serves relationship, and can only relate to it as something that's pathological, then likely it's not coming from a place that can actually see the territory that Integral is cognizing. And so I think, at the same time, there are perspectives that, are critical of Integral, where it also, I think, can see where it still engages in maybe carrying over some ideas in an incomplete way, or that it has incompletely digested past perspectives. And so I think, for instance, some people will criticize the way that integral theory holds tribal consciousness or indigenous consciousness as really not allowing for the nuance of development that actually was available, in those cultures in those times. So yeah, I think it's whether the critique can basically see what Integral sees and then point beyond it, or whether it's just trying to tear down some of its pieces without being able to take the more global picture.
Yeah, I think there's two kind of issues here, and one is, what does it mean to think about going beyond Integral? And then the other one is, what does it mean when Integral gets critiqued in a way that's reasonable? And so a reasonable critique could come either from your fellows, people who are seeing things at the same level as you, but with a different style and a different emphasis, because Game B has a more technological emphasis and metamodernism has a more socio-political emphasis. And they'll sometimes say of Integral that it's too psycho-spiritual in its emphasis. And so these might be legitimate critiques at the same level, or they might also be just indicating that each form is going to have a specialization. We need all these specializations to complement each other. And the other question is there a beyond Integral? Right? And that's a little bit ambiguous, because you could either say, as Integral sometimes does, hey, we're about this, and we are proposing that there's stages beyond us, or we could say that it's sort of just a synonym for second tier, or a synonym for a whole set of developmental options, that if they went beyond, if you could legitimately assimilate and embody and understand Integral and then critique it, are you then non-Integral and you're something else? Or are we going to call you what Integral means now? So I think there's a way, for me personally, I think of Integral as just a whole set of stages of understanding, most of which have not emerged yet, and all of which are going to grow by critiquing themselves.
That's a really nice point. Just something I've been wondering recently, and we don't really have time to unpack it here, but it's sort of something maybe everyone could look into, or whoever's interested, is how culturally specific Integral is. I've been really interested in the work of Joseph Henrich at Harvard, looking at weird psychology, so Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, so most of us here. And I'm very struck by just how rigorous that research is, and how profoundly different weird psychology is to other more collectivist cultures, for example, and how different the value systems are. I'm really curious whether development is also different in those cultures, and to see what studies have actually been done around, that's a critique I'd love to see, but that critiques the whole validity of developmental theory to begin with. And I'd love to get Joseph Henrich and Ken having a chit chat, but that's a big topic for another time. And I think we have a couple more questions. We have maybe time for one more.
Yeah, maybe a couple more. Yossarian, your question has as many upvotes as everyone else, but I like it, so I'm going to choose it.
Hi, let me refine this question. I didn't actually think it was a great question, but thank you, David. Yeah, I mean, my question was essentially, and I've noticed just this even in myself. I got into Ken in the late 90s reading A Brief History of Everything, and it blew my mind. And I was like, wow, he sees the world like I do, but it was probably more, he sees the world like I'd like to. And so I noticed, I mean, just to give context to this question, Rebel Wisdom has been, and the IDW to some degree has been kind of a bit of a red pill for me, being a longtime progressive. And so I'm seeing the shortfalls of some of the left. And that's helped me, I think, be more moving towards tier 2, as an example. I'm not claiming that's where I'm at, but that's where, after becoming a fan of Ken's, you kind of go like, that's where we're heading. That's where we should all try to get to. So I guess the question that I wrote down was, does there seem to be a lot of people who think they are tier 2 thinkers, but who are in fact lower on the developmental level? And that clearly just kind of sticks people that are already within the integral movement itself, that are familiar with all the terminology, that could even, I guess, be critiqued on that level. I've heard Ken talk about that we need approximately, I think he said, 10% of population to be at a certain developmental level for the entire culture to start moving up into it. And so yeah, I guess that's the piece that I'm curious about. And David's comment about having an allergy to green, or the woke factor, or, kind of reflects like where our own personal shadows are blocking us from transcending, including that piece, like we're somehow blocked from moving up because there's something wrong with that stage that we sense somehow.
I've just put your question in the chat. You cut out a couple of times during it, but I think we got it. I'd actually reframe that. Yossarian's asking whether a lot of people who think they're second tier aren't. I'd actually reframe it. Is there anyone who reads his books who doesn't immediately put themselves into second tier?
Sure, and that's not an integral problem, right? That's the general human condition, which is we hear about things and we imagine that we are embodying the things we heard about immediately. So there's an issue there. I think there are two ways, at least two strong ways in which people imagine they're at second tier when they're not. The first is they can use the words about second tier that they heard. The second is they had some personal experiences that seem to require trans-rational, trans-personal, higher level explanations, right? So, but then the test is not what they're talking about or went through. The test is how are they talking about it and how are they being with each other? So it's really important to shift from the content to the style, because if somebody wants to yell at you that they absolutely had a transpersonal experience, what you need to grade is not whether they had that experience or not, but why are they yelling at you? What level are they coming from in the way they've chosen to express themselves, whether it's about the experience or it's about the terminology.
By their fruits ye shall know them. To show that this goes way back, right? It's easy to profess. It's not as easy to embody. Just the other day, I was thinking about, some of those metaphors from, Christian and Judeo-Christian thought, traditional Christian thought that I think are still applicable that, in these related communities to think about, which is, functioning as light, functioning as salt, functioning as yeast. How can we as community function as light, basically to illuminate, the different issues and problems of our time, the different challenges, the different horizons of possibility? How can we function as salt to preserve what needs to be preserved and to bring out the richness and the flavor of all the diversity that's there, that it can be better savored and appreciated? And yeast, how can we function as yeast to move into different spaces, into different territories, into different communities, and promote healthy growth, expansion, development in ourselves and in others and in our relations in our communities. So I just wanted to throw that in there. I love playing with those, old metaphors and seeing, what kind of truths can we yield from them right now.
So I think we're getting close to the end. I think we've got time for one more question.
Go
Go on.
on. We forgot. Yeah, that's nice.
Clay, do you want to ask your question?
What, in your opinion, is the most helpful resource should someone want to get into becoming the being of integral theory?
That's a really neat question. And I would say personal relationships with people who are in the community is probably the main thing. But I could also recommend something that I did, which was pick up Ken Wilber books and read the footnotes rather than the text. Because that's where he's at, and those are the nuanced points, and that puts you in the conversation he's working on rather than hearing his sort of public-facing PR summary.
I pretty much would, agree with that in terms of, I think entering into these kinds of dialogues is really important. I think the dialogical, everyone's talking about dialogos these days, and I think we really need to keep cultivating and practicing that art, help each other, I think, begin to learn to think with our whole bodies and in relationship. one thing that worked for me also that I thought was, at least growth producing for me was not only to, read Ken Wilber's books, but actually begin, I think this should be actual, this is actual, humanities kind of study, is actually go to the source texts. Don't only rely on these summaries and integrations, but really reach out and read in the areas that are of interest and begin to practice your own synthesis. One of the things that Bonita Roy talks about is that there are many different ways to go meta. And I think you can look at the different ways to go meta, and you'll find those reflected in our communities, and thinking about that is really helpful. But one of them is to, move orthogonally. And, so take whatever your presuppositions are and then move to another space to see what would the world look like if this other element was at the center, what I call doing autochoreography, moving around and trying out different perspectives. What would the world show up like if this was centered, for instance? And circulating through that can help you really, I think, digest and begin to synthesize perspectives in your own life and mind in an individual way, beyond, just, grokking the model or whatever.
The film you just watched was a conversation that happened in Rebel Wisdom's digital campfire. So to join conversations like this, to submit questions, stay for the after hours hangout to talk about the ideas in the films, and to practice and develop some of the skills we talk about on the channel, check out the membership options. There's 3 different levels of membership. Sense makers get to join our regular Sense Maker showcase events with some of the most interesting thinkers around.
And also the monthly Wisdom Gym sessions, where we speak to and also have a chance to work with some of the world's best teachers and facilitators. Explorers can join the Rebel Wisdom Book Club sessions, the monthly philosophical journey sessions, and also the regular Skills Academy to practice skills like mindfulness, sovereignty, and sense-making.
Also, Rebel Wisdom will be at the Inner State Festival in Albania in September, so check out the link below for details. And from now on, all members get to join our monthly AMA sessions with us, where you can ask any questions about anything to do with Rebel Wisdom.